So yeah, so like JW introduced, we've consolidated a little bit of research on each of the different structures, focusing on first and foremost what the structures actually entail and what they look like, not just the connotations of the structures, but really what they entail in actuality. Second, we look at some of the growth options, whether that be funding or whether that be the restrictions or benefits imposed by each of the respective structures. Third, we've identified a number of case studies of what different levels of success could look like within the constructs that we create for RGI.
Yeah, and so going forward, as JW mentioned prior to, the two main things that we're looking when comparing these structures is values and impact. So how do we grow and maintain all of the 9 values that these two companies were built upon? And then also, how do we optimize the impact going forward? So we don't have to sacrifice or give up those values, but then still maintain that level of growth where we're able to reach even more people. And so the first one that we'll look at is the nonprofit structure. But to give an overview before we do, we'll be looking at nonprofit, for-profit, and public benefit corporation. And so each of these three provide a unique sort of structure that allows us to do this in a different manner. And the first one is the nonprofit that we'll be looking at. And we provided research, benefits, and challenges of each because they all, while have their upside, they also have their downsides as far as obstacles that we have to overcome and different hurdles along the way. So the research for the nonprofit is since 1970, more than 200,000 nonprofits have opened in the US. And of those, only 144 have reached 50 million in revenue. That's less than 0.1%. And that revenue, touch on those, includes fundraising and profits brought in by fundraising events such as that. And that's what the third point, as far as it requires continued funding for this accelerated growth. And so, but with that being said, nonprofits create impact in their communities and across the globe, unlike these other two structures that we'll compare. So while it's very hard for a nonprofit, and we've seen this unsustained growth across the board, it has a tremendous impact in the community and across the world. So this nonprofit structure that you're looking at is a little unique compared to the standard one. This one was inspired heavily by Robert. And so it put RGI with a board at the top, and having a revenue generating branch is the key of this. So overcoming one of the main hurdles as far as a nonprofit structure is this self-sustaining potential, and how, like I mentioned prior, many of them may have a large revenue and great impact, but it's reliant upon largely single source donors and then annual fundraising too. So in the structure, you have a revenue generating branch on the left there. And so this would include the two companies right now that exist, Rayhons Financial, Joshua Development. In the last meeting, we also talked about real estate. So going off for other ventures like that to make profit. So real estate would fall under this revenue generating branch. And so the concept here is the profits made from this revenue generating branch would go into this consolidated fund that is again controlled by this 12-member, we kind of talked about different numbers, term limited board. And then also the money is directed by this think tank. So right now this think tank has been the decision science team, people who really do research and look at where that money is going to go. Because another problem we see with nonprofits is they may have a lot of money, but they'll sort of throw it at all of these different places because they're just ready to go and make an impact, but they're not really measuring what that is. They may not make the best use of their money. And so that's really the focus of the think tank, is to say, okay, we have this great idea or this great project that we want to do, but what is the best one? How can we optimize the money that we have and make sure that we have the greatest impact at the end of the day? And so then once that money gets approved, it would go over to the community service group, which the main one right now is the Strong Fathers. So foundations, charitable ventures like that would go out into the community and really give us that end of the day impact. And we have other ones on here like clean water and various others that we would pursue going forward. So
In this scenario, the RGI would be the nonprofit?
Mhm.
Gotcha.
like a nonprofit conglomerate of sorts.
Yep.
And one of the other cool pieces of this, just to add on really quickly to what Alex was saying, is that when people come in with a donation and they want to make sure they're able to maximize the impact of that donation, they can start to influence some of the initiatives that are taken on by the nonprofit, the operating nonprofit wing of the conglomerate nonprofit, and have their impact in that way. So it's not just like we're doing kind of our own thing and we're not open to new ideas and new perspectives, but there's a very clear defined engine for those things to be done when people have, you know, the donations they're willing to put into it, and an understanding of where they want that to go.
So under this scenario, no financial advisement services would be provided through the nonprofit. Under this scenario, all the financial advisement services would be done through Rayhons Financial as the for-profit,
RGI is still a nonprofit structure here.
right?
And so RGI would own Rayhons Financial.
And Rayhons Financial would be a for-profit entity though, or not?
Not in this model, no.
Okay.
So everything becomes nonprofit.
Right, everything becomes nonprofit. The revenue generating
In this model,
branch
yes.
serves to provide profit of sorts to carry out community initiatives.
So essentially, in this model, what we'd be saying is the current Rayhons Financial and Joshua Development, going forward, any profits would go into
The nonprofit,
funding the nonprofit.
the consolidated fund.
You got it.
The net proceeds minus expenses would go into that, would dump into that fund.
That's what we're saying.
But everything would fall under that umbrella as a whole.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
So Rayhons Financial and Joshua Development, as they exist today as for-profit LLCs, would be abolished
Yes.
under this model.
Under this model.
I get that simple.
Yep. Yep.
And I recognize this is a new model that Robert has really helped to develop. Curious if there's any perspectives at this juncture from the audience, or not the audience. That sounded bad. From our remote attendees today.
A question I have is, in this model, is all of the community benefit or the impact-driven work then only in this community service group versus through the financial services provided?
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, Caitlin, I believe the answer would be yes. So the financial services provided, because that would become a nonprofit entity, then could serve the other, nonprofits, if you will, on the right-hand side of that chart. Is that what you're asking, or am I missing it?
Yeah, I guess the real question behind my question is, with financial services being a core competency of Rayhons and the consulting being a core competency of Joshua Development, and the gap that exists for lower income communities for both of those services, it just seems that there could be a major opportunity to focus your funds. I mean, same model, but it catches me to see different charities when you have so much to offer.
Oh, no, I understand what you're asking now. So the answer is yes, we would serve the community in that way from also the financial services we offer as well as the consulting we offer.
Under this model, can a nonprofit, never mind, answer my own question.
But back to what she was saying, I'm looking at this third column, and that's off mission. That's not what you do, right?
Yeah, those would be new entities.
Or you say, what could we put in there that is
Yes.
what we're good at,
Correct.
right?
Yep. And those are just examples at this point. So yeah, think of them that way. Those are just examples. So it would also be closely aligned with our current mission and what our skill sets are.
So hypothetically speaking, if one of those boxes were providing financial services to the underserved.
Yep.
Yeah,
You got it.
and Jada, if I'm wrong here, but I would imagine, like she was saying earlier, as far as serving those communities, like these two companies would still be under the revenue generating, but we would sort of create an entity under that community service that would provide services that we already offer, but not with the focus of profit, but serving those underserved.
Yes.
So,
You're correct.
So in this model, your existing Rayhons Financial, Josh Development, your core competencies today become financial generating engines, so you can
Yep.
serve communities.
Yes.
The key benefit here is the self-sustainability, like Alex was talking about. It allows us to grow in a sustainable way where we're not too reliant upon single donors. But we're also able to generate the impact through the competencies that we already have, like Rayhons Financial and Josh Development.
My own experience over the last year, I've been a director at 2 different nonprofits over the last year. And one of them was Think Tanky, right? It was based in Washington, DC, very influential, dependent entirely, it didn't have a revenue stream, it was dependent entirely on philanthropic gifts.
Okay.
Right? But as the philanthropists changed the way they were funding and supporting and things like that, then you end up at their whim, and that organization, after 20 years of national influence, had to shut down. The one I'm at now is much more on, it's another nonprofit, but it's much more in the revenue generating branch. So it's an education assessment company, but it is a nonprofit. But it is very self-sustaining because it has products that are out there, which then allow it to bring in people like me to then think about sort of what are we going to do think tanky wise and go out and do and accomplish those other things. So to me, I see those 2 models, but I've lived in organizations where they've been kind of very distinct, very unique.
Yeah. So then this model is kind of combining those 2.
Yeah.
Rather than
Yeah.
having one versus the other.
In the new, do you mind if I ask one question?
No, please.
So in
That's
the
what it's
new,
for,
in the new role that you're in, the new organization you're with, you ever find the revenue generating product side of things turns into the tail wagging the dog?
I'm new there, but I certainly could see how in any organization that could be that could be a possible thing, because you are relying on that. But at the same time, it hasn't closed the doors, and it doesn't close the doors to going out to those philanthropic organizations and saying, hey, we're interested in doing this project, but we need a little extra help or a little extra exposure, or do you want to jump in with us on this and try to accomplish something even bigger? And that works in those kinds of situations.
I had a similar kind of question. I'm the chair of Delta Dental of Arizona, and the parent is a not-for-profit technically, but they also have their own foundation. And the way they funded that was they said, okay, what is the contribution likely to be required in order to meet some of our goals? So they funded the foundation up front, and then said, okay, every year you can go ahead and spend everything but the corpus. And so, and I liked, similar to the conversation we've had, what I like is they are very clear on their mission. And so they do everything for dental health. So that goes to their dentists, the member dentists. When the pandemic started, they came in and said, we have to have a lot of new equipment. They were able to put some of that there. And they are working right now with one of the big hospitals, because their ER is about 35% with people with dental issues. So they've figured out how to serve that need. So I think you're going down the right track of doing what you know well, and how do you just help people doing what you do. So I think you're on the right track with that one.
Thanks for that example, Candace. I appreciate that. And even just how you mentioned that they have a nonprofit parent, but still were able to create a foundation within the nonprofit structure that they have as a parent. The other thing that you mentioned was just a clear, singular focus on dental, that has helped them with their mission.
Staying in their lane.
Right. Yeah.
As opposed to
Where kind of a think tanking method is not always that way, especially if you have donors trying to direct.
No, it's actually very much that way. You stay in your lane because the next nonprofit over has their lane, the next one over has their lane. You guys all want to play nice together.
Gotcha. Okay.
So.
Okay.
Well,
Thanks for the information.
to use a really cheesy motivational poster from before my time, the eagle who chases 2 rabbits catches none. And so trying to expand our core competencies while still generating revenue just distracts us from what we're good at and where we can create benefit.
Fair.
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin.
I'll see you.
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, if you touched on some of these advantages here. So one that wasn't a little bit was the tax benefits, obviously. And these savings will again go back to servicing these people. So these tax benefits are again the advantage of those that we will serve. And like Ted was mentioning, under this structure, we don't shut ourselves off from donors and such. It's more so we save ourselves from, like he was also mentioning, being at their whim, being at their beholden to them, and having our direction or our mission sort of heavily influenced by these donors. We're able to keep some level of independence while also saying if we have a specific project like clean water or something and they're really interested in building this out to the community, we can say, okay, we don't have enough money, but if this is something you're really interested in and they donate, we can go ahead and carry that out for them. Along with this, we don't have on here, but donations, but government grants and subsidies for specifically nonprofits are widely available. And they're exclusive to nonprofit entities, and many of these go unclaimed. What we are finding and showing competency we would be able to secure many of these. And then the last one, like we mentioned, overall is this demonstration of values and commitment. So JW putting his 2 companies into a nonprofit structure and giving up that ownership and saying 100%, these are our values and this is what we're committed to doing. Under a nonprofit structure is the potential advantages.
So some of the potential challenges to consider, both in like a more traditional nonprofit structure and kind of the human structure we mentioned, is kind of the growth versus impact debate, and that largely focuses around the short term. So when you're getting either revenue or profits generated from the profit generating wing, does that get funneled back into growing the nonprofit so it can provide more impact in the long term, or does it go to generating more impact in the short term with those profits? So just something to consider. The other potential challenges are control and flexibility. As you do lose control of the company and you are reliant on donations to some extent, there are possible concerns about maybe having the mission a little bit changed or being accountable to donors for the things that they donated for. In terms of the flexibility, that largely addresses funding resources. Obviously, if you give up control of a company, you cannot do private equity funding or VC funding, which is available in some of the other models we're going to discuss. And then the self-sustainability is unproven. While there have been nonprofits that have been able to become largely self-sustainable, many still rely on consistent donations and rely on those external funding sources. And while the 2 instructors have attempted solution at that, it is not necessarily proven or a clear-cut success at this point.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, this is a question that we may not have an answer to. This is more my curiosity than anything, but earlier, one of the stats that you guys had up there was that only 144 have generated more than 50 million in revenue out of 200,000 nonprofits. Of that 144, do we have any idea how many of them were really based on a single large donor, or maybe just a handful of large donors versus actually generating the revenue in excess of 50 million?
So what made them different?
Yeah.
Right, and that was the main thing we came to in our research. We don't have a number for that, but the research indicated that it was a majority of them that relied on a single donor or a small set of.
Even the 50 million plus one, the 144 that are 50 million plus was
I'm thinking
still.
of like a Banner Health,
Yeah.
College Board,
They
giant
Right.
nonprofits.
They're getting help.
Yep.
Sure. There's a ginormous nonprofit.
No, and it's certainly a possibility. We're not saying that those don't exist. We're saying that there are a number of them that have access to those certain pools of money. Like we found with some of the hospitals, right?
Yeah, healthcare is obviously a very different issue with a lot of unique characteristics in terms of insurance, the different costs associated with Medicare and Medicaid was a lot of the stuff we were finding. So they kind of had unique business models that allowed them to really maintain that self-sustaining growth. But what we found is largely in things that are more similar to what we're trying to do, there tend to still be relying on donations for the most part. because donations aren't included in that revenue. So one of the largest ones of that 144 was Habitat for Humanity, for example.
It's largely donor based.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, that helps.
So that's, I think that's our last slide in the nonprofit section. Before we move on to for-profit, are there any residual questions about either standard nonprofit models or this new proposed model?
So I guess maybe if I could, I put out to our advisory board members from your own, any nonprofit experience you have. So Ted, you shared a little bit about your nonprofit experience, and Candace, you did as well. Any from the others that have nonprofit experience, is there anything else that we need to be aware of when it comes to that type of structure?
You kind of alluded to this, but one of the things I've seen working with relatively small nonprofits, not major ones, but you know, it's appealing because it feels like you don't have to compromise your values, but I have seen the pressure from certain donors be very similar to pressure from investors. And that alone can drive you to have to abandon certain values you hold, whether you're a nonprofit or for-profit. And then I think the other thing that is interesting is that your funding mechanism with a nonprofit has different metrics than your for-profit. And considering how we are able to produce results for those donors and measure our impact, and if we're set up for that, those are just two considerations I think about in this decision.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Caleb.
I totally agree with Caleb. My experience, sometimes donors, and the reason I was asking you the question I was asking you is because the tail wag the dog at times. The reality is sometimes donors, you have someone really drop $1 million on you, and they have something that's really important to them, and it's similar to what's important to you, but it might be a degree or two off.
Okay.
Are you willing to receive that $1 million?
Right.
Now they've designated money towards an initiative that's really important to them. They're expecting you to do it. And it's closely tied to what you're doing. And you start doing all kinds of little mental hurdles and gymnastics. And it could create mission drift for you.
Okay. That's a great point.
The other thing is the revenue side of things. I mean, I mentioned this to JW last time we were talking. The largest leadership consulting organization in the church world is gone under. Essentially, it's defunct.
Which one's that?
Leadership Network. So started with Peter Drucker and Tom Patterson and Bob Buford. And Bob recently passed away. Bob was bankrolling the thing essentially. And because they didn't diversify their income sources, they're unable to provide the resources and tools they used to provide.
Okay.
And they've been lost for quite some time. And so, yeah, that's a concern of mine as we have this conversation.
Doesn't make you invincible.
No, by
Yeah.
no means does. I mean, there's definitely this cause side of it that I want to be so tied and concrete attached to my values that this feels like a nice warm blanket that allows me to do that. That may or may not actually be. I would encourage us, encourage you, JW. Your values are your values, and you haven't strayed from your values being for-profit. So you're going to follow and chase and make decisions based on the values you have, whether you're for-profit or nonprofit.
But the exception, though, is the board supporting that position moving forward. So if you think about revenue, and then you think about control. Revenue today, we have one bucket of revenue, and that bucket comes from two for-profit entities. Tomorrow, revenue is going to come from, again, those two entities, but then now they're going to be nonprofit, and there's going to be a new bucket of revenue that's donor-based. Correct? Yeah. Okay, so that's how revenue flows into the mothership, if you will. And then control on vision, mission, values. You mentioned a proposed 12-member term limited board that is fiduciary. That board adopts vision, mission, values. The board makes decisions based upon those direction of vision, mission, values, controls your job. You report fiduciarily to the board,
Yep.
And then you control then below that from a structure that's also approved by the board. The budget's approved by the board. And then when somebody from a donor perspective, as it pertains to control, decides they want some restricted funds to come in, the question is, and pardon my word choice, how much of a whore do you want to be in accepting restricted funds versus it going against what your core values may be? But those restricted funds are going to come into what I'm going to call the third bucket. And our third bucket has some diversification that's appropriate for somebody who is interested in donor giving. Then you cultivate that, which obviously you're very familiar with.
Sure.
So just a slight deviation to that would be, so first of all, I'll wrap my head around Dignity Health, being chairman of the board of that organization. So just locally, we're $27 billion in revenue. So huge machine that was largely based upon revenue generation based upon paper service. Whereas our donations to the foundation equated to about 10 million of that total 27 billion. So it's a big difference on what we receive from donations, at least at the hospital level. But the entire system fell under that nonprofit umbrella.
Yeah.
So we, a board developer, we're 13 years old. 10 years ago, we established Board Developer Foundation, nonprofit 501c3, to provide services to nonprofit organizations specifically that needed assistance with board development, but couldn't afford board developer services. We provided that service now for free. The difficulty in that scenario is that no funds legally can flow from the nonprofit to the for-profit. It's a federal offense. I can't even serve on the board of the nonprofit, even though I founded the nonprofit. But that was the kind of the intent behind that. Was a little bit different of a model, and it's, I think, based on our need was, we developed what a solution was. So I think under this scenario on the previous slide on what is our needs, and then does this solution make that impact for that need? And I think the challenges are kind of eye-opening, but I could see positives to all those challenges, interestingly enough.
Yeah.
We get to now open up our kimono and say, hey, we're this great organization. What we do now is, nonprofit based. It becomes a game changer to people mentally.
Yes, one of my reflections after I watched the video of the last meeting that I missed was the concern that being nonprofit would somehow lower the respect. And in my world, it's the exact opposite. You are going to be viewed with absolute suspicion if you walk into the education space as a for-profit, right? Yeah. There's just no question about it. I just thought it was interesting to see it. To see the flip-flop there.
Don't hear me say what I'm not saying. Not trying to dissuade. I just, whatever structure best serves purposes, let's do that.
Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah, and and we're off to a great start, because this is exactly what this is designed to do, is have us discuss each of these different models to help us have greater awareness of what might be the direction that we decide on. So this is outstanding.
To that point, though, on stigma of financial services, specifically in the financial services industry, did we do any research with any potential customers or existing customers about whether us shifting to a nonprofit would be a turnoff for them?
As far as like Rayhons financial services customers?
Yeah, so if you have a wealthy person who's going to go to you, you're going to make lots of revenue off of this client, would having two identical organizations, one being a for-profit, one being a nonprofit, would they show strong preference towards either to help consider the marketing aspect of this decision?
Yeah. So the main answer to that, Caitlin, is no, we did not do that. I did it personally with just a handful of our clients.
That counts.
The bias, though, is they're already clients. And so already knowing us, they said, we don't care if you're for-profit or not for-profit. And to them, it was mainly like, they because they're not investing in Rayhons Financial, like as a shareholder, they're a client of. And in fact, two of them, one of their comments were, well, we didn't really know what you were anyway, because all we see you doing is community stuff. So that's why I say, I don't know if it's a good measure, because they're already clients, the relationship is already there. Would it deter any potential clients? if they knew we were one or the other, that I don't know.
And what Ted is saying is very possibly just the opposite. But Caitlin, you actually made me think about something that was an untapped market that we currently could serve, but if we were a nonprofit, it could be huge to serve. And that's us being the financial advisor for nonprofits.
They could. Yeah.
Huge. So every HOA that has millions of dollars in their reserves, they invest those dollars. And as a nonprofit financial advisement institution, we're given credibility of being in the same space, if you will. You reach out to the churches of the world. You have millions of dollars in reserves, I presume, and those dollars are being invested somewhere. Are they invested? And if there's a decision from the board, to a fiduciary board, investing those dollars into an organization that also is a nonprofit, that's fascinating, because then your fees that you pay, I don't know this answer, very well could be tax deductible. I don't know.
The fees you pay. Well, I mean, it kind of depends on the accounting they do, because right now, like for any corporations that we do that type of advisement for, their fees are already deductible because they're expense to the company. Because of it's not a commission.
No, but I'm
Every
saying
fee is a fee.
the fees in this case, if it was a nonprofit,
Yeah.
those fees become, a donation, a tax deductible donation, because it's going to a nonprofit. I don't know the answer, but I think it does open up that world.
Yeah,
Going
and you bring up an interesting point, because under our current structure, those fees go to Voya, and then they go to us. So, because the regulatory.
So those fees would continue to go to Voya, which is it for profit,
Which is a for-profit.
and the money that comes out of that for profit from Voya going to the nonprofit would not be to pay.
Right.
It'd be still tax deductible, but it would not be a donation.
Yeah.
But I guess
So-
where my mind was though on the nonprofit marketing aspect of it.
Right.
Of reaching out to nonprofit organizations saying that we are also a nonprofit. I think it shows. I think boards in general will be sensitive to that. Is that fair? Yeah.
Because however it flows to us, so even if it comes from Voya to us, they still have the confidence to know that what we're doing with it is going back into either, the community or the impacts we've identified.
There's potential that peaks have the emotional ties, like, oh, you understand us, you're like us,
You get us.
you get us. There's an opportunity for a higher level of trust to be formed faster.
Sure. Yep. It's a good observation.
New opportunity for impact.
Yeah. Thanks, Gabe.
Our bank has financed churches pretty steadily all through the last 15 years here in Arizona. And largely, unless you get to a really large institution, and there are some really large ones here, it's difficult. There's not a lot of expertise, let's just say, on the boards with those. So it's very difficult. And I know that there are kind of chain churches, I'll call them that. Those are the ones you really want to get to, not the standalones and the Catholic Church, they have their own sort of banking system. So I was on the board of the Catholic Community Foundation for a long time, but that market is pretty good. I think that's something worth thinking about.
In-house.
Yeah. Well, they have some managers that they have to do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Candace, you spurred a great conversation. So that's what we just had a sidebar of the way the Catholic Church does it. And I just mentioned that they actually do still hire investment managers to manage that fund. They basically have the investment committee, but then they'll hire sub-managers to manage the investments themselves.
Yeah. I know it's another sidebar, but 10 years ago, I was on a diocesan school board for a very long time. And about 10 years ago, all of the parishes became independent entities of the diocese to eliminate their liability.
Yeah.
Every one of them became independent. Every one of them ended up having their independent boards.
I was on the big board with the bishop. It was in there for their foundation. Very interesting. I mean, the clerics, especially our bishop here, he wields a lot of power in about everything. So that one would be difficult, I think, at best. But they do hire people, and there is sort of a national thing where they talk about who they're hiring. And so it would be interesting to figure it out, though.
The nonprofit piece, which we didn't talk about, and I'm curious, I don't know the answer to this. What happens to our liability or potential liability? So hypothetically speaking, today, you invest dollars for somebody, they don't like it, they don't like what you did, and you get sued. Never happened, but let's just say that it happened.
Yeah.
You'd go through and Voya would be involved and they'd hire attorneys. Plus now in the new day, we're a nonprofit, someone comes after us and now the mother's share is control of much more dollars. Someone wants to come after the financial advice, again, sue. Are they suing, in this case, the mother's share versus suing just Rayhons?
It'd still be just Rayhons, and it's because, again, it goes a little bit back to the structure we have now within a broker dealer, Voya being the broker dealer. So
Because they're in control.
because, yeah, so each advisor has to carry E&O insurance, there's an emissions insurance for situations like that. And then Voya's attorneys would be
That wouldn't
involved.
change under the new scenario.
It doesn't change,
Okay.
no.
If broker, we're ready to go.
Cool. All right, so we've looked at nonprofit, the different possibilities within that structure. There's also a number of different for-profit structures. One of them, to start with, is the one that we're operating in now, pursuing organic growth. So that's kind of the progression of, especially some of the consulting work that's been evolving over the past year. Some of the new hires within Rayhons Financial and Joshua Development, the type of growth that we've experienced this year. Granted, it is easier to grow just from a financial standpoint when you have some influx of capital at the beginning. There's a couple of key methods for accruing that, which one of them is debt funding, one of them being equity funding.
How long was Robert?
Robert, about a year and a half.
So
Or
since
no, it's 2 years this month.
2 years. Since Robert started under the equity VC funding piece, we have been unsuccessful, not without trying. So Robert has sought out different organizations to go after that component, and we've been unsuccessful.
And in
Just
that,
just
yeah,
FYI.
in that
That
arena,
might be a good thing for the conversation we're having right
It's why I bring it up.
yeah,
Hence,
yeah, and most of the feedback is essentially been, you're too small.
Yeah.
In those conversations.
Yeah, and it seems like it would need to be more of a VC than a private equity funding, based on new generative ideas that can develop into branches of RGI or so be it.
Yeah.
One of the benefits of debt funding above equity or VC funding is that the ownership of the company still belongs with JW, and he is the primary stakeholder of the company. Whereas within the debt funding structure, there's personal liability issues that get involved there.
personal guarantees. But the areas we could go down, which we've not done yet, is like an SBA.
Yeah.
Which could be an option.
Sure.
Which is very low interest.
Yep.
Very low risk. Okay.
So we decided to throw a case study in here of a company that was able to successfully leverage some sort of initial capital. But one thing that we wanted to focus on here was the focus on impact as opposed to purely profit. So there were two primary methods on which Microsoft was able to achieve the type of impact that would be consistent with JW's values and impact. One of them is an internal commitment. Basically, Microsoft made a commitment not just to approach carbon neutrality in the present day, but also to offset all of their historical carbon back to 1975. So that's just an example, but there are ways even within this type of structure that you can pursue impact even internally within the organization. One of the justifications for doing that within a for-profit structure, even if you're looking at profit, is the net present value of investments into social capital So you can justify it from a PR marketing perspective. However you justify it, there are mechanisms in place that you can pursue impact even within a for-profit structure with investors and stakeholders, shareholders. The external source of impacts driven by Microsoft has been Bill Gates' ability to develop a foundation based on becoming profitable, generating profit, and leveraging that profit on the side to create a separate nonprofit entity that's able to take on the initiatives he wants to take on outside of the jurisdiction of Microsoft for-profit entity. So we figured this case study, obviously it's not a perfect example.
Perfect example, totally an apple to apple. Sure. I'm being sarcastic.
Yeah, so I mean, Bill Gates might have different goals than Jay, but generally speaking, there is an ability to drive impact through a for-profit structure.
Yeah, but you have to be giant to do it.
Sure.
It's the scale issue, right? Yeah. Cool. So just kind of a summary of the for-profit structure. One of the benefits is the increased control. You still own the operation as opposed to a nonprofit structure where you're technically not the owner of the operation, it's a community-based ownership. And in pursuit of that, by owning the operation, you're able to control the commitment that you have to your values of impact. It's not somebody else where I think it was either Paul or Ted who mentioned the creep of donors into the kind of the understanding of the values and impact that an organization wants to have, which is possible in a structure that you do not own the entity. When you own the entity, you have full control over that. Another benefit is the financial freedom and flexibility within the structure. When you generate profits, you have flexibility as to how you use those to create impact. Not to say that that isn't present within any structure, but that's specifically emphasized through the Microsoft example.
Insofar as the board or the investors or the funders are going to give that model, give you latitude.
Say that one more time.
Well, he said you have full flexibility on what you do with your profits. I'm saying no, not actually. Right?
I'm talking about, like, for example, Bill Gates' ability to take the profit that he generated from his success at Microsoft to fund a foundation that he has full control over. So it's not a mutually exclusive thing. Like, you can develop a for-profit entity, you can use the success of that for-profit entity to fund and continue whatever initiative you want to take on. And one side benefit of this structure is we're currently operating in for-profit capacity. There would not be necessary restructuring at the scale of re-identifying ourselves as a nonprofit entity regarding Rayhons Financial Services.
So in this scenario, just in general, in your guys' opinion, do we have more street cred becoming this nonprofit great story to be able to tell versus going down the path we're going down today? Do you see that as being sexy, lack of a better word?
Well, when I was thinking of it, and like Caitlin brought it up, and I was thinking of like growth, when you think of growth and tying that heavily into the sales and marketing branch of the business, that aspect of being a nonprofit, like we mentioned, going to other nonprofits, but then also saying, like, at the end of the day, the services we provide for Rayhons Financial and Joshua Development, like, we're gonna provide that top tier service. So I feel like, yeah, the nonprofit is like a two-way street sort of with it. It's like we're able to go to the nonprofits while saying, hey, ourselves are a nonprofit, opposed to for a for-profit. Then, like Ted mentioned, you know, you come for education, you come in as a for-profit, and education, they look at you kind of weirdly. But I think the industry we would have to examine, and that I don't know. As far as the industries that we are in, the street cred that you mentioned, how much of the benefit is that for financial services and for consulting? And I'd say that's something that I've been thinking about since it brought up, and I haven't had an answer, but yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I guess we could ask the question of everyone individually. When you think of, you know, financial investment services, and when you think of consulting and coaching and training or organizational development, you think of those two industries, do you immediately think nonprofit or do you immediately think for-profit? And does that lead us to what you're asking, which is do you have greater street credit one way or the other?
I immediately think of for-profit, but I also think from a marketing perspective, this sounds wickedly sexy.
Yeah.
Because you talk about what are your values, of what you have created for the last 20 years, and it leads your philosophy of life. So by continuing that message, I think it just resonates so well.
Gotcha.
I naturally think nonprofit, because that's where I live. So,
Do you think if you're going to hire a organizational development company, it's going to be a nonprofit? Interesting.
I definitely tilt towards the nonprofit. I see so many opportunities and I don't see any. It comes, so one other place, let me try to, I'm gonna ramble a little bit. But the organization I was with immediately prior to the two nonprofits was Grand Canyon University. I just worked there for like 10 months as an assistant dean. But what was interesting is they were clamoring to become a nonprofit, right? And they did, but they had to do it in a very creative way, right? You know, and when one of the VPs asked me, you really need to do this. You're in the education space. You really need to get that stigma off of you.
Yeah.
that has to happen. But you know, and I think about not being able to go, not having success going out to get some VC funding or something like that. So that avenue is not going to work, right? But so if you want growth, the other tree to go shave is to go down the nonprofit route and say, look, we're gonna turn and we're going to still have all the same goals and the same values, but how we're going to route our profits, we're going to publicly proclaim that we're going to keep them right back in this.
Yeah, which is cool. And do it,
Which is cool.
And using Grand Canyon as the example, because they were for-profit,
Yeah.
clamoring to be nonprofit.
Yeah.
And obviously even the size and scope that they were, that was a challenging thing to transition to go through.
Massive.
I understand, if I understand correctly, now they have both.
They do.
Right, because they have an aspect of their organization that's for-profit and actually publicly traded.
Yep.
And then they have a aspect that's not profit, which I think is the education delivery.
Right.
But the operations,
Or
I'm
operations.
oversimplifying, but the core operations are for-profit and publicly traded.
Yep.
Okay.
Which then allows them actually to go off and they can start to do that kind of service providing to other
Yeah.
colleges, in fact.
Yeah. So you guys are probably almost starting to envision like the service and support operations aspect of Rayhons Financial as a service to other advisors versus Rayhons Financial as a provider to clients.
Yeah. Part of also is your motive. Your motive in doing this is genuine and pure. It isn't to capitalize on something. So I think that message is incredibly impactful because it's all about what we are, not who we are.
Okay, Caitlin, Candace, any input here?
I encourage us to look carefully at market segments. And so I think it makes a lot of sense if we feel there's a massive market opportunity within the nonprofit industry to be a nonprofit, because it's very true that the stereotypes of the for-profit versus nonprofit feud are real, even in socially driven groups for both sides. And so I'd say that if that's the segment, then that makes sense. If our market segment is to go pursue more wealthy individuals to drive revenue, I'd be a little concerned. And then, you know, I just encourage, I think the trends we see in business, the trends that are coming out of the market indicate a future of business that is more socially driven. And I think we're going to see a lot of for-profits that can define and set those standards do really well because they're leaning into this kind of innovative, forward-thinking view of the purpose of business. So I disagree that you have to choose between the two. And I don't know, I think actually some of the more shiesty organizations that exist in this country tend to be nonprofit. So I think that there's two ways of looking at this, and it has the most relevant in data here is who do we need to fund this from a revenue generating perspective?
We have one more model look at still. Yep.
We're almost.
I have a question. And so when we talk about serving underserved people with financial expertise, how do you go about that? I mean, if they don't have assets, what are we actually offering, I guess, is what I wonder. And do people come? I mean, at one point I wanted to have a separate arm of my bank in California where we would we would be a check casher at lower rates than the check cashers are, with the idea that if they were good citizens after 6 months and we didn't have any issues, we could say, you just need a bank account. And to me, I could get my arms around that and say, you know, yeah, people are paying fees they don't need to pay generally, but I guess I missed something. What is the audience you're trying to help, I guess?
If you think about that, Candace, in general, you have a number of individuals that fit into this category. And let's stereotype just for a moment. Most of them are probably struggling financially. Most of them probably may have had a difficult upbringing. And then the culture and the patterns in which they learned how to handle money was probably not the best. So simply put, be able to help an underserved population to learn how to budget, learn how to put money together, learn how to balance a checkbook. So we take these things for granted. And then for them to be smarter with how they spend, not just understanding what their budget is. So I think in the beginning stages, it's offering those types of services. So clearly these people aren't going to be investors, but I think that we can make them be smarter with money as a whole, then people make wiser decisions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Jim, I don't know, do you know the Crozier fathers?
I do.
Yeah, I like those guys a lot. And they actually have, they'd be a great place to have resources because they're down in the South Mountain area. And that's what they're trying to do, is to lift these people up in ways that'll make their lives better. So thank you for the explanation.
Yeah, and so this is where, and this what you just described is what I'm kind of thinking as well, and that is that what we're talking about is education related. What you're doing is you're educating the population. You're talking about a financial literacy, right? A financial strategy, and helping Arizona become better at that. And there's not a single group out there that's going to ever say, no, we don't want to increase financial literacy. Right.
Yeah. And to add a little bit to that for you guys, and this may come up at the board meeting too, we do own some intellectual property around financial courses. So we have 3 different sets of courses that we own the intellectual property for, and the copyrights, and they're meant to hit different audiences. One is designed for like a self-study audience. The other is designed for like small group family, friends sort of audience. And the third is designed to be more of a facilitated course sort of audience. So we have the resources already for something like that.
I see that angle as an education side, but also looking at these 3 on that right here, the kinds of work that you're able to accomplish and get out of guys like this.
Oh yeah,
Scale that up.
absolutely.
So under this model, on one of the bullshit up there is that profits can be used to fund a separate nonprofit. So hypothetically speaking, don't change anything at all, open up a brand new nonprofit that has the ability for Joshua to and/or Rayhons to use as a tool and to put money into to fund.
Yeah.
Very similar to what I did with War Developer Foundation. Because we're the sole funder of that foundation. And so it's part of our philanthropic gift.
It seems like JW's style as a person lends himself very well to incorporating at least a nonprofit structure. I think the question then becomes, is that the parent company of everything that's done, or is that something that we allow the for-profit structures to fund?
If we go forward with this, you might want to reach out to the Federal Reserve. They actually have programs for financial literacy. And that might be a good resource to say, go to them and say, we're trying to, this is what we're doing. And is there an opportunity to maybe help you somehow? Because that's a big deal for them as well.
When you say the for financial literacy, and is that they actually will fund the where you were going?
They actually have, I don't know how many people are in that group anymore, but they had a group that literally was across the country and talking about working with organizations to promote financial literacy. So it was pretty interesting. I haven't looked into it for a while, but once we have some clarity, it might be worth a call.
And it's not just that, but financial literacy is a big thing.
Yeah, we'll definitely capture that, and that's something to look into over the next few weeks as well as and down the road, whatever structure.
Okay.
Cool. So just to highlight a couple of challenges within the for-profit structure. I know it's been mentioned that there are new business models that are potentially less profit-driven, but more impact-driven and focus on different ways of measuring impact. But the reality is, within a structure where there are shareholders that own the majority of the company, they're still going to be looking for profit. It's granted it's less relevant under debt financing and organic growth options, but it's still a for-profit entity is defined as for-profit. So that has to be a consideration under the structure. Another challenge is that there's no benefits like there would be within a nonprofit from a tax perspective. And this last concern, I don't know how huge it is because a lot of people that have contact with JW, their understanding of his value system is not based upon the structure of his company. I think somebody mentioned that, right? Didn't you say that like some people you talk to, you need to know if you were for-profit or not for-profit?
Yeah.
So JW's kind of value system stands for itself. But within some contexts, if people don't know who JW is, the for-profit entity, just a for-profit entity, not talking about B Corp, has no legal commitment to values and closure in it.
It's really interesting, Justin, that you said something really sparked for me is that we have to start thinking about this beyond JW. This is not about JW. I think he's led us to where we are today, kind of built that vision, mission, values. Moving forward in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, that legacy can continue through in a nonprofit form, and having those values continue that are more about the broad brush versus his little brush today. That makes sense. I'm assuming you support that.
It does, and I'm glad that you mentioned that because one of the goals and the vision that I've had from years ago is that eventually it takes on its own identity. It's so wrapped around the identity of me per se, but that it would have its own identity with these values at the center. It's like these values that we have, the 9 values and behaviors that our team is extremely familiar with. That is what actually shapes the identity of the organization rather than say me personally. So I appreciate putting some flavor on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that wraps up our discussion of the for-profit within our conversation here. Are there any questions about the for-profit before we move on to a B Corp sort of model?
Good. Everybody's good? Okay.
So B corporations or public benefit corporations kind of ties in a little bit of the nonprofit aspect in terms of the legal commitment to values, or like the defined commitment to values, as well as some of the benefits of the for-profit model. So a public benefit corporation is not very different from a for-profit in a lot of ways. There's like no tax benefits, things like that. But your own, even when you add in additional stakeholders, you are not only legally responsible for maximizing profits or the fiduciary responsibility, you can also pursue public benefit in any of areas such as social benefit, environmental benefit, things like that. Requirements for registering as a B corporation vary by state. In Arizona, B corps are required to provide an annual report comparing themselves to a third-party standard. There are a number of organizations like this. The most common is B Corp. And basically what they do is they evaluate financials, your operations, and put it to a standard to see how truly you're living up to your values and then publicly release that. And yes, a huge advantage of it is that it provides the visible demonstration of the values and commitment in the definition of the company itself.
Quick question on this. Did you look up B Corps as the kind of certification organization, or did you look up public benefit corporations as the tax designation structure?
Both, and there's not a tax designation for public benefit corporation. It varies by state, and there's very little different in tax filings. You file as a Class C typically still.
Thanks, Will. Yep.
So the potential benefits of this is that, as I mentioned earlier, it codifies what makes us unique. It puts the values into the purpose of the company. And that can be a signal of potential partners, as we talked about the marketing opportunity as a nonprofit, how that could be attractive to people. Similar way, you're kind of putting your money where your mouth is. You're saying here are defined values beyond just making money. So the challenges for this are that you're held to that third-party standard, right? You're released on a public report every single year comparing you to this third party, and they may have a different interpretation of your values or how they're carried out, or how they measure the carrying out of your values. There's no direct tax benefits. I think in a couple of states you maybe get slight tax breaks, but for the most part, the only real benefit is you get access to increased community data from other people about what they're doing and how they're making their practices more sustainable. And then the other component of that is that there's different investment profiles. This is again kind of a pro and con. You're probably going to attract more people who are in line with their values, but at the same time, it does limit the investor pool in case there are people who are purely seeking profit or have different values that you might.
Clarify real quick, these are investors in RGI, not investors with REITs.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in general, do these things work?
Yes, we're going to go into a case study. There's a couple of really famous ones that definitely. So Kickstarter is one of the most popular ones. Other ones are Patagonia, the clothing brand, is probably the most well-known ones. And so in the case study of Kickstarter, they were funded initially by Jack Dorsey and the venture capital group that really bought into their mission and what they were doing. Had that kind of investor profile alignment. And then now at this point, they're 35 million in annual revenue. They experienced massive growth from 2010 to 2014 and have pretty solid net income numbers as well up to current day. So it does work. There's a proven kind of model that people have had success with this model.
With the third-party standard, I guess how solid is that? I mean, what's that being compared to? How much data is there in terms of our standard of holding ourselves to our values versus the way other organizations do within their B Corp? So just any enlightenment there.
So the Arizona law on it is that you can pick any third-party standard, and that again varies by state. But Arizona specifically, that means you can pick pretty much any third-party standard. It's very vague and gray area in what constitutes a third-party standard for that. So you do have a lot of freedom in being able to pick an organization that aligns with your interpretations of your values. But in certain states, you need the B Corp certification. They have their own specific. B Corp is a nonprofit that is one of these third parties.
Oh, okay.
And so they have a very more rigid, I guess, definition of what this would look like. But in Arizona, you could pick a less rigid one if you wanted to.
One of the B Corps
So there's a
would,
national standard, if you will, that you can abide by, but the states vary. So in Arizona, you can pick it what you want.
B Corp themselves are the somewhat environmental slant.
They have like an environmental component on there.
Oh, okay.
So there's different, some are more environmental, some are more wealth inequality, some are more social benefit. They all kind of lean a different way.
Okay. So then I guess a follow-up question to that then is, if RGI is the B Corp, then how do we choose which one of those third parties we're going to hold ourselves to when one, say a financial planning or financial investment service firm, another is under consulting, training, coaching, others, real estate. So does it make it more difficult for us as an RGI to figure out what third party we hold ourselves to.
I think almost like reversing the situation where RGI can maybe be just a pure for-profit, and then the sub companies or like the Rayhons Financial zone or Joshua Development zone could be a B Corp and apply to a standard that more specifically fits what they're attempting to do.
Okay,
I think that could be a potential solution to that problem.
gotcha.
There's also some that have relatively general standards.
There also are, as it's a huge gray area, there's thousands of these organizations. They're ones with pretty general broad ones that would allow you to probably hit all of them from the Ray or from the RGI or something. And so kind of the key takeaways is that yes, growth is possible in these models. Patagonia and Kickstarter are two very successful companies. There are a number of other ones. They tend to be more environmentally tilted, but Kickstarter is an example of a non-environmentally based one. And then the other takeaway that's kind of on the more negative is that the main benefit is largely based on perception. So because there's no distinct tax benefit, there's no tangible benefits for registering as a B Corp. A lot of it is kind of just an outward demonstration of your commitment to your values, which as we discussed in the for-profit, people have already seen through JW's actions, that same level of commitment to it. So there is a little bit of room for debate in terms of how much value the B Corp certification holds over being a nonprofit, just promoting your values.
Okay.
So that concludes our section on B Corp. Curious, I know Caitlin's probably going to have some comments and some additions to what we put together here.
I think I'll just push a little bit on the perception point. I agree with your point. I think perception's a very big reason that we've seen a lot of success for public benefit corporations, and there's several in Arizona. I know one specifically off the top of my head that's a bit smaller. But I think in a lot of ways, each model we take on is perception based. And we have to think through who the audience is that we're talking to for both the revenue generating and the funding. And so, you know, this is a way to, if we go for profit, marry the concern or address the concerns we have about the for-profit model while demonstrating some innovation and repositioning potentially to a different set of donor or a different set of investors than we've spoken to so far. Because B Corp does offer an entirely new community, or public benefit corporations, as well as B Corp as two separate things. And then the last thing I'll say is I think it's an opportunity to be innovative and to demonstrate social innovation from a business model perspective, which is something I do here. But at the end of the day, it comes down to who are we talking to and which of these models is going to be the most appealing to them, at least from my perspective.
Other thoughts from any of the other advisory board members for this model? Thoughts or questions or other examples that maybe you're aware of that are public benefit corps or B Corps?
Are people more likely to make donations to B Corps?
So
No.
this would not be, B Corps are not tax, shoot, the words are slipping from my head. You do not get any benefit from donating to a B Corp. And so it would be, you would still be working with investors that expect a return.
Paul or Jim, any other thoughts, questions?
I know it's none, so I think my opinion becomes it looks clunky to me. And that's just because I'm it being an unknown. I didn't know Patagonia was a B Corp. That's fascinating to me. But I think if you think about what we're trying to solve, is this a solution to what we're trying to solve? And I guess that begs the question. And then the other thing that popped in my head is, what's broken that we're trying to fix? And the answer is nothing. What we're trying to do is enhance what our future looks like. And is this an enhancement to our future, or is just make our future more convoluted, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah. Caitlin, any thoughts on Jim's comments there, by the way? Just because I think of the group, I think you're most familiar with these than maybe the rest of the group. So that's why I'm seeking your insight and response.
And I'll put this out there, like my general personality type is somewhat disruptive. So take that with a grain of salt. And so, but you know, again, I see this, if we're looking at where we're trying to go, I hear this tension between the values and the need to grow and to be funded with that. And if I hear the goal of trying to incorporate values into our structure so that we never have to compromise them. But then I also hear not wanting to be reliant on a donor base or have to compromise to either investors or to donors those values. I see risk, unless it's written into the charter of the organization as a for-profit. I don't know how you address that as a for-profit, right? You will have that risk. As a nonprofit, unless you really feel confident that you have a set of donors that you can rely on, not just 1 year, 5 years, but 10, 15 years into the future, that will also listen to what you as the organization on the ground say you need and say this is the right thing to do for the community. And so what I like about B Corp is I find it to be a way that you get to say, nope, this is what we're doing. We're going to retain some control out of it, and to define and maintain the definition around what that future is. I think I addressed Jim's thing, but let me know if I missed it.
Yeah, no, so any questions or additional thoughts based on what Caitlin shared there?
Caitlin, I made the comment of it being clunky. Do you agree or disagree with that?
It's new. It's way newer, way younger of a model than what you see out of nonprofit or for-profit. So it may be clunky. It may have its own challenges as a new thing. So if we did this, we'd have to be saying we accept that with that kind of innovation comes road bumps. But so that is absolutely a con of this model.
I would say as an action UJW is that I would make an appointment with your tax CPA, say what we're doing today, or there's no change. What happens to our tax liability if we go to option B? And what happens to our tax liability if we go to option C?
Yeah.
And with him, based upon existing dollars and somewhat of a little bit of perceived future dollars.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously as a nonprofit employee, or you get your W-2 just like you would get
Right.
normally. So in that world, it wouldn't change your personal expense, your personal tax liability, but it would change for your corporate filing. Your corporate filing, you become a 990 and tax exempt.
Yeah.
Versus today you're paying income taxes based upon a for-profit LLC.
Yeah.
But I'm not a CPA, but just
Yeah.
I write the check. So
Yeah, I can ask about that.
Okay.
So I guess, perception has been brought up a number of different times. So I want to think of perception from a few different ways. So one, let's start with, and here's, I guess I'd like to set this in, let's imagine for a moment, we're already ahead of where we are today. In other words, let's imagine for a moment, let's just call it a couple hundred, team members, whatever multiple $1 million revenue we want to pick. And so here's where I want to look at perception from a few different views. One is whether we're any of these three, does it change the talent that we have the ability to attract? Because we always want to, I want us to always be attracted to high level talent, right? So, and by the way, I'm not asking these questions to try to gain any sort of answer, just to gain your perspective, your insight, whether you think there is or isn't. So let's start there. Do any of these models change how we attract talent and who we attract? Okay.
Yeah.
So what are our thoughts there?
Don't get any close out of this or.
Sure. Oh yeah, you can close out of this.
Yeah, I would imagine moving to a nonprofit model, if you actually elevate that in your story and your narrative and the conversation in your recruiting side of things, you're going to attract someone who's attracted to that matters to them, right? It's not just about making money.
Yeah.
Now the other side of it is they're working to make money.
Right.
So if you can do the job in an excellent manner, in a profitable manner, and still not just hold true to your organizational values, but also from a nonprofit standpoint, the difference we're making, because we're a nonprofit, we're not just making money, but also have the ability to do serve our community in a very unique way.
Uh-huh.
Particularly younger staff recruiting, it's gonna give you an opportunity. With that narrative is gonna give you an opportunity to attract younger talent.
Okay, thank you. Other.
It doesn't mean lower salaries, right? Everything can stay. It could, right? But it doesn't, but there's no, it doesn't have to mean that at all, but it does mean that you're going to be more, you're going to look more appealing to those people who share your mission.
Okay.
You want more out of it than just to make money.
And you're gonna attract more like-minded.
So one quick question I want to ask on those two is, does a B Corp accomplish that same thing from a talent acquisition standpoint? Or do we feel like maybe not quite, that a not-for-profit still has an advantage in terms of talent attraction for being mission driven, essentially, for mission alignment?
I would think so. I mean, Caitlin, I think the Caitlins of the world would think it would be sexy.
Okay.
And I think people go probably have a desire to work for Patagonia, obviously because it's Patagonia, but also probably because it also was a B Corp. And I'm curious though, on the flip side, if I'm a financial advisor, let's say for a moment that I have a $500,000 in, let's just say I have $300,000 in annual revenue with my business. And I'm being loaned for you to acquire me. And you're gonna pay me a salary, but I can't have any equity if we are a nonprofit. I don't get a play in the equity of the entity.
Yeah.
So I have to be a mind that I believe in this structure as well. What I would say in general in the FA world is would be unusual. Yeah. Less common. Yeah. So interesting.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
So, well, you get a little skin in the business.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah. So again, no pun intended.
Right.
Because with who we just went through. But if as we go on the roadshow to grow our Rayhons portfolio, does that help us or hurt us in the sense of attracting that type of talent? It makes the messaging different. But I think at the end of the day, do financial institutions or financial advisement institutions sell their book of business to make money? And the answer is yes. Sometimes a lot of money.
Yeah, so let me make a quick distinction on that. And this actually may end up leading to another conversation we'll be having with the advisory board down the road. But there's a bit of a difference between if you're a investment advisor, a registered investment advisor, RIA firm, versus R, which is a advisor representative, investment advisor representative. So let me explain what that means, because it's very crucial in the conversation you're talking about. So if under our current structure, we go to acquire another advisor, then essentially what happens is right now we come to an agreement of what we're going to buy them out at over some period of time, right? So they don't end up gaining any equity in Rayhons Financial per se. We simply work out an arrangement of like a purchase over a period of time.
Still do that as a nonprofit.
Right.
You can do that as a nonprofit.
Yep. So, so from an equity standpoint, there's not really the expectation in our current structure that there would be an equity position. There could be an expectation of some sort of revenue share or profit sharing, if you will, once they become a part of Rayhons Financial.
Sure, as a nonprofit.
But that's not shareholder, that's not equity.
Sure, and as a nonprofit, you could call that a bonus.
That's right.
Right.
You could write it as part of the agreement, however you want to write it.
Correct. So now if we look at if we were to become a registered investment advisor, RIA, then that becomes different, because then if we acquire an advisor, we can provide them equity in that RIA firm.
But we're not that.
But we're not that critical. Yep.
That's helpful.
So hopefully that adds a little bit of detail to what you were asking about.
That helps you.
Yeah. So right now, whether we're for-profit, not-for-profit, B Corp, we could pursue acquisitions for other advisors in the same manner we do currently.
So then the other piece
Without
of
an
it,
equity expectation.
the other piece would be under your Joshua development arm, attracting talent. Does the attraction of talent change? And the answer is yes and no. Yes, because you attract a new type of talent that really believes in the philanthropic component. And no, because we're attracting talent, like we're attracting talent today, that it isn't the change. But I think I have a question for the data science team. Is that your name this week? Decision science. Your decision science team. And that is, does it, in your guys' world, do you think it makes it more attractive by joining the team, if us being a option A, B, or C?
Well, I can't speak for everyone. But for me personally, it's more of a connection to what the organization is doing and who are the people within the organization as opposed to
Irrelevant structure. Okay.
For me, in terms of recruiting external talent that isn't currently much of talking about clients with the Rayhons financial sector, we're not already familiar with JW. I would think that nonprofit would be a slight disincentive specifically in consulting.
So I've been being specific to adding people to the decision science team. For you as an individual, that makes it more appealing to me.
Oh, so one person, then no, it doesn't matter. The structure, similar to
The same answer.
Yes.
Nonprofit.
Why?
It speaks to and holds that company accountable to what they say. And I was looking at something. I was on the American Bar, and we've done like extensive sort of research to try to figure this out, and especially how you guys were talking about equity. And so like a nonprofit, RGI being a nonprofit at the top, but then having for-profit subsidiaries is very tricky, but can happen. And it can be legal. So that is again something that we've talked about, and just something to keep in mind as far as that goes. And when we talk about bringing on talent, because that was a concern that we talked about too, is when we have talent and they want equity or something like that, that technically is possible. It's obviously disclosed on the nonprofit branch, and all of that equity still has to be held. The majority has to be held by a nonprofit, released public, and all of that. But I would say that hybrid structure that Robert built out, similar to a B Corp, similar to an L3C, I feel that, like I would say, at the very top, what is the company standing for? What are they doing? That to me is,
Yeah, what you mentioned, Dignity did. So I assume a lot of you have seen the standalone Dignity hospitals, or they're like square buildings that say Dignity Health on them, and they call themselves a hospital. Technically, that's owned by a company. It's called Adeptus. Adeptus is a for-profit, publicly traded entity that Dignity Health, the nonprofit, owns. So technically it's a JV, but the majority owner is a nonprofit. So it's very fascinating, and you're absolutely right. It's incredibly difficult to manage, and very, very a lot of skepticism.
yeah.
How it gets done.
How about Caitlin or Candace? Just from that overall talent acquisition, does it change? Does it give us an advantage in any of the three options? Again, visualizing us ahead of where we are currently.
I'm good. I don't have anything to add.
Caitlin, how about you?
I'm very biased because my background is so in the depths of social entrepreneurship in particular. So I'll just go out and just own that. But I see a mission-driven for-profit as a way for you to capture talent from both a nonprofit talent pipeline and a for-profit talent pipeline. And so I see it, I think it allows you to have your cake and eat it too.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm curious, what are a couple of companies that you would say are in that lane, that they're mission-driven, for-profit, and can acquire talent in both lanes?
Yeah, so I saw this a lot at Zero Mass Water, which is an Arizona company. You see this a lot. I mean, there's a lot of little startups out in Silicon Valley that are mission-driven. I can send a list. I have a spreadsheet of companies like this, actually. Another one that's really interesting that I'd encourage us to look at, I think Thorn is a for-profit company, but they've got a very kind of for-profit model focused on fighting human trafficking. You can see, I'm just kind of going through, Another company that is attracting both would be like REI is a very retail focused company, but they're attracting talent from an environmental perspective from both the kind of marketing for-profit side as well as the environmental activism side. Again, these are just what's coming to my mind immediately. I can send a longer list of a handful of names to look into.
Quite frankly, Rayhons financial today. Yeah, I mean, your community vision, mission is what you've driven yourself to be, and not focused on being a capital driving, money growing, profit hitting.
You wouldn't have to look at our financials too long to figure out how mission and community driven we are.
Much it irritates Robert.
Yeah. One of Robert's early comments when he joined us was, well, I'll say it in my way versus Robert's way. Why do you give away so much money? Was one of the things Robert asked me about whatever his comfort level with 3 months in or 6 months in. I don't remember what it was, but so the answer is, yeah, like anybody could look at our financials and very quickly notice we're very mission and community driven.
And if you become a nonprofit, everybody will be able to look at your finances.
That's right. Yep. Okay, good point. So with the remainder amount of our time, I think what will be important for us to kind of clarify is, do we feel like there's any additional information that we need to make sure is presented in each of these three models when we go to the board meeting? Because what the objective is going into the board meeting is not to help sway the board one way or the other before a discussion is had. It's to make sure that we're clear that we've provided enough information up front of each of these three different models so that the full board can have an in-depth discussion, questions during the meeting itself. To then come to a recommendation back to me as far as what the board thinks is a good direction. So what other information should we gather between now and then for each of these models, if any?
Okay. Yeah, so that's helpful for me. So at the end of the day, you're looking for the board to offer you a recommendation.
From the November meeting. Yep. And that's why I don't want it to feel as though this task force is giving the board a recommendation. I want the board to know and feel that they're hashing out these three models and then providing a recommendation back to me. Because as long as, and Jim can add some clarity to this, that's essentially what the expectation of our advisory board is basically provide advice. And then we determine where we go from there. But
I think a summary of today's conversation for them to share with them the questions that were asked, and I think it would be helpful. Okay. And so they can see that in some type of context. The only other thing I saw as an action item is that what is the financial implication from tax perspective to be able to share with them as well. I think that'll be helpful.
okay. So can I ask a
Real
question on that?
numbers on that one.
Yeah, based upon
Where's that?
hypothetically from
Okay.
2019's year end, if you were option A, B, or C, here's what the
Real cash
financial
impact would have been.
what the tax impact would have been.
Okay.
Administrative question, go ahead.
Administrative question. This has been recorded. As far as the summary goes, what questions were asked? Is that something that your team does, or is that something that we need to do internally with our team?
Internally with your team.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So then,
We can send
because
that to
you hosted it, you'll be able to send us the report.
Or do you
All right.
want to be sent to Justin?
Yeah, have Justin be the report person. Great.
Thank you.
Also, real quick, I was really unsatisfied with my answer about what company examples, so I added a link in this chat. I added a link in this chat that's got that can take you to a really long list of portfolio companies from an impact investor group.
Excellent.
I email it to you. Cool.
Good.
Justin.
So we'll make sure, thanks, Neil, and we'll actually put that in the summary itself as well.
So one of the things that may be helpful, it's an exercise that, and again, I really, the only industry I've really been in for the last 30 years is banking. But one of the things I like to see is sort of a risk assessment from each of these structures what's the benefit to the company and the benefit to the community and what risks are in there. And so that you can look at this and just say, okay, if we adapt this, these are things we need to be thinking about. What are the risks? What's the implementation? Do we have the expertise? We're talking about one structure that is very new and has a lot of, it has its own bag of worms to carry with it. But I think it would be helpful for management to do that for the board to say, this is what we view as the risk and reward and the challenges that we might be able to, we might encounter. So.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Candace. Just you captured that. Okay, excellent. So a risk assessment given each model. Okay. Other details or questions that we should have for each of these?
That was excellent, Candace. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that.
I'd encourage you, when you guys make this presentation to the board and you open up the conversation, and here's what we're looking at, here's a couple of different ways we could potentially go. What's the big why? Why are we considering this?
I mentioned that earlier, but the word that I used was just it enhances. It's an enhancement to what we're doing. We're not fixing something that's broken. But it's quickly back on the previous one. I don't know if it's extra work, but if you did a quick SWOT for each one of them, I think that would be a nice ability for the board. They're all, except for Caitlin, are older. They'll get it.
It's a visual. The guy that does leadership is out there,
I was just trying to hear you.
Right.
And I don't want to lose sight though, what's your goal? What do
What are you trying to get
what do you really want to get accomplished? And I like the idea of thinking 40 years down the road.
Right.
You walk away from this, what do you want to leave behind?
Yeah, that legacy. And also on the flip side of that, I also talk about your family. And obviously it's at what point does the family get to do or be involved in what you created, as opposed to selling off like other FAs do.
Right. Which is all by their choice. As of right now, there's none of them that are interested, but 2 of them are 7 and 8 years old. Sure. The other 2 have not shown any interest, but
I'm interested that way. I just meant interest as far as the family having this legacy of this nonprofit entity.
Yeah.
Does that show that it's as opposed to you retiring, and then retiring with what? Is it a pension? Is it because you guys are a nonprofit, there is an advantage of having pensions.
Yeah.
As a nonprofit, there are advantages of having different types of opportunities for people when they leave from a funding perspective. And as a for-profit, you're pretty limited to 403Bs, 501, or
like
401K
is defined benefit plans.
and you can ESOPs.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in the nonprofit world, you actually, I guess you could do a pension for a for-profit, but it just
Not common.
it just opens up the world. Because obviously in the nonprofit world, municipalities, you become vested into a pension program. I think in your 7th year in public service. It's all, cities or nonprofits and towns.
So Ted, any additional thought from what you were starting to share?
And it's there is this still, what are you aiming for? And I'm not sure I have a clear answer to that myself.
Yeah.
As we sit here and talk.
And that
So,
relates
you
to
know,
Paul, what you're talking about is why are we having this conversation? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, part of what I mentioned earlier is of great importance to me. It's that the entity takes on its own identity at some point where it's not just because these are JW's values, it's because these are the values that everyone that's a part of the organization wants to be a part of. So that has a lot to do with it. But it's also wanting to create something that's impact extends extremely far beyond what I'm capable of. And that's where, I mean, when we look at some of the people that work within our organization now, all of you as advisory board members, it's because of wanting to follow that path. So,
but I want you to be more specific even than that.
yeah. So, I mean, I can share with you what I really don't care about is being able to sell the entity at some point for some huge profit or shares or anything like that. Like it just doesn't inspire me, it doesn't motivate me.
You don't need to cash out.
Yeah, I don't feel any desire to cash out and leave. But what I do have significant desire around is that the impact is being created from all the work that's been done by different people in the organization along the way, whether they were with us 6 months or whether they've been with us 50 years. That they can always be proud to know that they were part of that story at some point.
So that comes in and resonates to your world of what you want to do, and what resonates to your heart. And obviously this information becomes incredibly useful.
Yeah. And I mean, it's too, you know, you were mentioning earlier, working for a nonprofit doesn't necessarily mean that you don't get paid well, right? By the way, I care heavily about the people that work with us, and I want them to get paid very well. I want them to know that they can become a part of this organization, that they can know that not only is their work important, not only is their work creating an impact, but they're going to get paid well to do it, and be, you know, very fairly compensated. And it's okay if some of that is based on performance, and some of that's okay if it's based upon how well the organization is doing. But that's important to me too, is that anyone that works with us feels like they're going to do well too.
But I also hear you saying, you know, reaching out to the community, helping to meet the needs of people who need services that you can offer that can't afford those services.
Yeah.
Right.
It is. It's a huge desire. So, you know, when we think about, it's interesting because if people, the people who know the story of like the way my brothers and I grew up, in fact, Alex's brother Troy mentioned this in a conversation we were having, and Troy was mentioning it too. It's like we're not the norm. I mean, wow, I forget how did Troy word that? He was like, he's like, it almost doesn't make sense. Like, you guys are totally outside the statistical norm. There's no reason that all three of you should have done as well as you've done, given the things that you've been through. And it's not that I actually don't think that our story is all that special. And I don't think, I don't view it as all that difficult, because I know plenty of people that their story is what I think is far more challenging, far more difficult than ours was. But that's why, well, from an impact standpoint, it is to create environments where people who maybe are willing to put in the work and effort can still get the resources they need to change their circumstances. It would be for generational change, not just change in that person's life, but for generational change.
And you mentioned nonprofits. I just Googled what Peter Fine made last year for his annual salary, 17 million.
Yeah, running a nonprofit.
Yeah. CEO of Banner Health.
Yeah.
They like that apples.
Yeah, and also there, you know, when we look at, we're very fortunate in the U.S. And when we look at what will happen over the next 10 to, well, I guess it depends on the report, 10, 15, 20 years, there will be more Americans impacted by an inheritance over the next 20 years than we've ever seen in U.S. history.
Why?
A higher number of people will receive an inheritance. A lot of it has to do with the changes between the generation before the baby boomers, so that went through the Great Recession, and then the baby boomers. But when we look back in like the 70s and 80s, when things changed from pension plans to defined contribution plans, 401ks, it shifted the responsibility. It shifted the responsibility, saying, if I work for this company for 30 years, they're going to pay me for the rest of my lifetime. To even if I work for this company for 30 years, I'm going to have to pay for my own lifetime.
If it is a pension and you die, your pension's gone.
Right.
And now my 401k.
Now
yes,
all the wealth that I've built over time,
it's my wealth.
yeah, and it goes to who I want to go to. So
Or spendable.
yeah. So I do see a tremendous opportunity in front of us, and this actually doesn't have to do with just Rayhons Financial. This has to do with all the other things that you saw on there, whether it's Joshua Development and the current efforts that we're making there. It's basically equipping that to do global good, not just good here in the U.S. or not just for certain families, but really that can turn into a global shift in wealth and inequality that we've not seen before. And a lot of that work started taking place, but we want to have a major contribution in that. Is that helping you?
No, this is, I'm glad you're saying these things out
A lot of
loud.
times it's easier
You're
for me.
taking notes on
Yeah, I was
this,
gonna say, a lot of
right?
times it's easier for me to express vision when I'm asked questions, like, I don't just outwardly share kind of like what's in my heart.
But we
But
need
when I'm
those
prompted,
pieces
when
on
I'm
the-
prompted by questions, it makes it a lot easier for me.
but we need these pieces on the table,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
I'd strongly encourage you to get some thought before the next board meeting,
Mhm.
as you tee this whole thing up for the board, to be able to succinctly say,
I agree with you, but I don't think you should say it up front.
Yeah.
I think that he'll create them as group thing. And I would, yeah, so have it,
Yeah.
have it ready, but I would seek input first,
Mhm.
before you share.
Yeah.
You know, and start crying.
Okay. All right, before I start crying? Oh, yeah, all right. I don't know if that'll happen, but.
I know that it would happen.
Yeah.
pinch yourself.
That's right, yeah. Okay. So again, any other, these are great additions. Any other information that we feel like we should have going into the board meeting?
I have one quick question. From the people who are more experienced with like nonprofit side, I'd be curious to hear specifically what advantages you see to integrating it all under one nonprofit system versus doing what Jim Hayden has done, where you have a for-profit that funds a nonprofit. What are like positive benefits and what, I guess kind of why what are the other? I'd be curious. 'Cause I'm not really, that's the one thing I'm still not.
I wanted you guys to research that personally. Because to me, that's not a model. These flex models aren't things I'm used to. So,
So I think the main thing with the flex model is just the self-sustainability component, because we find a lot of times nonprofits are not, Medicare they typically are. Hospitals done a great job with that, but we haven't been able to find a lot of examples outside of medicine.
but you already are profitable, right?
Yeah.
And so you're not breaking that in the process of becoming a nonprofit.
They're just shifting.
I guess combined with growth is what I would say.
I think the problem that he solved, as I understand it, you know, I was speak more to it than I do, but as I understand it, they had a problem they were up against, people they wanted to serve, clients they wanted to be able to serve. And so they came up with a solution to be able to serve their clients. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're like, no, we just want to be able to serve underprivileged, under-resourced, financially illiterate people in our communities, you can start a nonprofit just to do that, if that's the scope of what you want to accomplish, for sure. But it depends on how, I think the question comes to scope on it. What do you want to get done?
Thank you.
Yes, and for our model, it just worked, and it made logical sense, and I had never thought of it. We were brainstorming one day about, hey, why don't you start a nonprofit that provides those services to the to nonprofits who can't afford your services. It just worked, made sense, but I think our circumstances are probably different. Because I was thinking as you're going through this, like, I wonder if we would have made the board developer, the entire entity, a nonprofit, does that change our delivery scope and model? I actually think it does negatively, actually, because today we charge for services, and then there's a model in the nonprofit world that you apply for a grant and the services are done for free. But if we're all one big umbrella, every company that comes to us is going to want what? Free.
That was interesting. That's probably a good point to bring up too. Yeah. Because then it's like, how you're determining, like in your guys' case, you made that determination for other nonprofit entities, right? So for-profit
And they
entities
still have to
can't
apply,
apply
they still
for
have
a
to apply
grant,
for the grant.
right?
No, they can't.
You can still say no.
No, they can't. You have to be a nonprofit.
But even,
to apply.
but even to a nonprofit, you can say no.
Oh, yes, and we do.
Yeah, so it does, because if you don't have that really clear distinction, then it's like, how are you determining which ones you're charging a fee to? If the whole entity is nonprofit, how do you determine why you're charging these ones a fee and these ones you're not? Yeah.
So I'd love to know more about the hybrid possibilities.
Mhm. Okay. All right, any other input that we need to be aware of as we prep for the board meeting?
Did you guys have any other concerns that weren't necessarily addressed with the presentation that we can beef up and maybe they were addressed, but you'd like a little more detail or specificity on a couple of the components? Were there any of those for you guys you think would be helpful for the overall board?
I think that when you do the risk assessment, that'll cover a lot of the risk reward. I think that'll cover a lot of the questions that we might have had.
Thanks, Candace. So let me ask this one final question then. When we think about some of our other board members or other board meetings you've been in, can you think of any other questions they might ask that did not come up in our conversation today? Are there any other potential questions they're going to ask us?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think we beat this up pretty darn good.
So it sounds like we're probably good.
Caitlin, do
Okay.
you have a comment? Because you got muted a minute ago.
I feel like I'm beating a dead horse. I would just say, I think the risk assessment will cover it, but I'm really curious to see from the decision made, who the segments for growth we see are. Like, where do we see that revenue coming from as a factor in this decision? You know, are we going to go do services to nonprofits versus, you know, individuals? I think that market segmentation could be useful.
That's an interesting comment that you made, Caitlin. If we do the nonprofit option, do we become schizophrenic on what our mission vision is for profit generation? I mean, today we focus on our new development for clients for Rayhons Financial, bringing in money through Joshua Development. And in the new days, are going to be a group of individuals that are going to be torn away from that growth of revenue versus going after grants and other ways of funding. And does that hurt or does that enhance time? Because obviously you're the only rainmaker today, so maybe it doesn't matter.
Yeah, well, Robert is too. I'm a Joshua Development standpoint for our consulting, but yes. Okay. I think that I feel like that covers really well what we were wanting to cover today, and the objective of making sure that we've got enough detail with each of these models. Appreciate the input of making sure we've got a good risk analysis done, some SWOT analysis for each one, as well as, you know, why are we examining this? Why are we taking a look at our structure, and what is it that we're looking to accomplish? So I think this gives us the right direction for going into the board meeting. And I want to share now, even before we get to the board meeting, but I'm going to share this with our board too. I'm greatly appreciative of the time and effort and thought that all of you have put into helping us explore this path. Because we do feel like it's extremely valuable to our future, and each of your expertise and your backgrounds have really helped us to identify how do we make a good, solid decision for the way we want things to look going forward. Because we do kind of already, we see ourselves where we're headed. We don't always see ourselves exactly where we are right now. And so this helps us create that path and that journey towards that, where we see ourselves. So, cool. Justin, anything else that you would add? Anything else that you feel like the decision science team needs from our board members?
So, I mean, we've covered a lot of everyone's perspective. We did kind of center a lot of the conversation around the research, and I was grateful for you all to provide your own perspectives on each of the individual components of the research. I guess if there are any additional pieces of information or things to consider that weren't brought up that you think of over the next, I guess, week and a half, 2 weeks, if you could send that over to help us really craft a representative presentation of what we've come to within this task force, that would be very helpful.
Okay. Yeah, and so in addition to that is other sources, like if there are certain sources that you think we should be referencing, even like Caitlin, the list that you sent over. So are there other sources like that? Are there other case studies that you think we should use as examples of any of these models? The decision science team obviously came up with a few that you saw today, but are there others that we should include as case studies as we set up the conversation for the board meeting? So any of that you come across or that you think of, go ahead and send it over to, I guess they send it to you, Carrie, don't they? So Carrie, and then Carrie will make sure that Justin and decision science team gets it.
Okay.
So with that, I think we're finished for today.
All right. Perfect time.
Thank you. Yep. Thank you. Caitlin, Candace, we thank you too. Yep. Enjoy your weekend.